Hello. It's amazing I cannot see you at all because, there is light. Great. I was asked to talk about privacy in a more general way. And yes, I didn't hear any of the intro, so I don't really know what you were told already, but quickly on who is NOYB and who are we. We're basically a European non-profit organization. We're in Vienna. We do strategic litigation. The whole thing is funded by 5,500 people, so we're rather independent. And we have like a team of 25, just so that you have a rough idea of people that have not heard about us before. What we do is that we basically have enforcement types, so we actually enforce the GDPR, and we have what we call standard setting cases, so cases where we really try to kind of make sure that the law is enforced as we think, or that the law is interpreted properly by the Court of Justice, by the highest courts in Europe. The other thing that we do is that we basically have so-called enforcement cases, so stuff where it's kind of obvious, the law is rather clear, but it's simply not followed. And another thing we do recently is collective redress, which is super interesting from a legal perspective. And the last thing we also do is a bit of awareness stuff, just that you know that you've heard of that. So after talking just quickly about like the organization I'm representing, I was mainly meant to talk about privacy and why all of this is all that important. It's interesting, if we think about privacy, we usually have this kind of abstract word of privacy, and we just talk about it. And one easy way to kind of separate in privacy and think about the levels that we have here is that we kind of have two types of privacy we usually talk about. And I think that's oftentimes overlooked. Basically, we have this privacy that most people talk about in the sense of your credit got denied, something got leaked, something got public, where you realize, okay, this is a shit situation, I actually have a problem here. This is what we generally talk about. But a lot of the privacy that people are actually concerned when they raise things with us is not really that they have a direct consequence right now, but that they also have a feeling of surveillance or a feeling of something is icky or weird. And that is a bit what you can see with like the so-called, this goes too far, basically, okay. There's a slide in between that you should see, that you don't see. Anyways, there is the idea of a panopticon that should be here on the slide, which is a prison where there is a guide in the middle of or a guard in the middle of the prison and can basically look at 100 little cells, and everybody in the cell feels surveilled, even though actually no one ever looks at that. And that gets to this idea of freedom and how we can define privacy in a feeling element, not just in a way of how data is actually processed. And if we talk about these things like freedom, for example, we're usually talking about a very high-level idea, and it's very hard to grasp that. But if you go a little bit deeper, as oftentimes is understandable in the sense of, for example, people do not speak as openly when they know that they're under surveillance. So, for example, there is a different situation or a different way of me talking on the stage than if, for example, if I'm with friends, because there is a different trust relationship. A wonderful example of this type of privacy is sexuality. That's something that typically we all feel is rather private, but actually there is no logical reason for that. You could theoretically have sex on the streets. There's not really a logical reason not to have that, but it's something that culturally we decide not to do. There's other elements where privacy is kind of understandable. A typical example that we have is kind of the privacy in the voting booth. So we do know that people vote differently than they previously say. So, for example, when Trump got elected the first time, there was this huge discussion about, oh my God, people didn't really say they're going to vote for him, and later the results were totally different than we previously thought from polling. And we have that in Austria with the right wing since the 90s. We know that people, even in polls that are confidential, don't say that they vote for the right wing party, but once they're in the privacy of a voting booth, then actually they make their little cross there. So there is certain things that we can measure here. But some of the stuff is also not overly logical. My favorite statistic is men take about 10 seconds longer to pee if there is another person in the room. Who knows why, but there is certain elements like that where privacy is very much cultural and very much psychological, and I think that's what I want to kind of highlight here, is we don't always talk about, oh, can this data really have a consequence in reality, but we oftentimes talk about a feeling of surveillance that interferes with our lives so that people are less free if they feel that someone is actually tracking them. Obviously, a lot of the discussion moves on to the question of power, who has power over information, and moving into an information age. Obviously, if you know what the other side has in their cards or what options they have, then you have a much higher chance of winning or losing. So a lot of this information age that moves on to having data or not having data suddenly allows you to get a deal or get a better promotion or whatnot if you have that information, or the other way around, the other side has that information. So there is a lot of these power dynamics that privacy can deal with or not deal with. One other issue, if you talk about privacy, especially on a global level, it's really interesting because a lot of that is extremely cultural. So things that some people find super private, other people do not find private at all. To give you an example, in the 20s, this was overturned later, but the US Supreme Court was for the first time asked, is there privacy in telecommunications, in phone lines? And one quote from that judgment is that the wires are not part of the house or office any more than the highways along which they are stretched. So it's quite interesting that back then they said no privacy and communication outside of your house, goodbye. So that was basically the idea. That was overturned later in the 60s. But at the time, that was the thinking in the US. If you look at, for example, Germany, they already in the 80s promoted the right to self-determination as a constitutional right. So even these thinkings are very different globally. But the problem that we're running into right now is that we have a globalized internet and a globalized system. So we do run into the problem that even though we have different cultural feelings about privacy maybe, and even within Europe actually there is a lot of different feelings between, I don't know, Scandinavia and Austria, for example, my home country. So we do have to manage this now somehow, that we have very different feelings around that. And a lot of that I personally look a little bit into, or I personally think about not just as privacy as a topic, but as a bigger topic of informational redistribution. If we move into an information age, who has that information and who actually has the power over that? We could have the situation that we have the big tech companies, so to say, for example, having all the information, using AI to kind of process all that information, and thereby have a lot of power over our economies, but also over our societies. And theoretically, the right to privacy should give you that possibility to protect a little bit, to say you can't get everything of me and you can therefore not influence me all that much. There are counter rights, for example, the right to access to your data, which the other way around gives you information downstream, so to say. So you have freedom of information, for example, versus the government, or the right to access of your own information that allows you to counterweight that information flow and say, I also want to get some information to kind of the smaller guy and get it back down. If we now talk about these right to privacy, I'm a lawyer, so I usually come from the legal side of it all. It's quite interesting because it's oftentimes discussed, are we going to keep that? Are we going to be possible to actually have that? At least for the European Union, there is not really any way around it, because we do have these rights in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is kind of our European Bill of Rights, so it's part of the Constitution. And unless all the member states jointly agree that we're going to abolish it, this right to privacy is going to be here to stay. There may be times where there is kind of more interest in the public and less interest, but the general principle is not going to go away anytime soon. What is interesting is when the European Union had to decide about how to regulate all of that, we did get the GDPR that I think by now everybody is more than well aware of, and it actually had a huge backing at the time. So this was the election results actually, or the voting results for the GDPR in the European Parliament. Basically everybody was for it. Later, this was massively talked down, especially by a lot of industry lobbyists, by a lot of the cookie banners that everybody started to hate. So it was interesting that there is a dynamic that changed a lot in this right to privacy. Now, this is the law as we have it. It may change. We right now see that there is attacks on it. But what we mainly deal with is actually the enforcement question. It's wonderful in Europe that we have all these rights and that we have all of them on paper, but the reality is our phones are not much less surveilled as an American phone, for example. So what's the impact of all of that? And the impact is largely an enforcement issue. And before I talk further, it's obvious that there's never 100% enforcement. Law students, the first time they're in law school, they're like, oh my God, no one follows the law in reality. That's normal. No one follows the law 100%. But the question is how far the distance is between kind of what we have in the law and what companies, for example, do in practice. And in privacy, that's mind-blowing. Like, there is hardly any area of the law where the discrepancy between what theoretically should happen and what actually happens is that big. We recently asked a couple of data protection officers, I think it was 500, to actually tell us if they think that there is loads of non-compliance. And the question we asked was, if a data protection authority would walk into the door of an average company tomorrow, would they surely find relevant GDPR violations? So we already said average, relevant violations, not tiny stuff, and so on. And more than 70%, as you can see on this chart, basically said yes, you'll walk in and you'll find something right away. And a big reason is that privacy regulators, as we had them for a long while, looked like this. This was the Irish Data Protection Authority that used to regulate Google, Meta, Facebook, all the LinkedIn and Microsoft and so on. And this is all the supermarket, and on the very back end, that's kind of the entrance. There used to be 20 people or so. And that is how in Europe we then, in reality, try to enforce anything against any of these big companies. Now, after we put this picture throughout the international media, they got a bigger office and more staff and all of that. But for a long while, that was kind of the type of enforcement we had. Very analog, very traditional. And typically, these big companies just have more lawyers than the enforcement team of any of these regulators. And that's not just an Irish problem. We have the same issue, for example, in Luxembourg and so on. And it's not just a privacy problem. It's a much larger ignore the law problem. They also don't pay taxes. They also don't pay their employees fully, etc. So there is a bigger attack on the rule of law, so to say, and a larger ignorance on that. So as an NGO, we're even smaller than these regulators. We try to find ways of being able to enforce anything and also not having any investigative powers. And one of the things we thought about, for example, was how we enforce speeding tickets, in Austria at least. We have these speeding cameras, and that's a fully automated system that just checks your license plates, finds out who is the owner of the car, sends the ticket there, and you get a code to pay your fine, and that's it. Like, no one ever touches that. In most of the privacy litigation, it still looks like that. Like, most of the lawyers are doing digital enforcement in paper. So the most digital that we usually have is Word. And that is kind of how a lot of these problems work in practice. We did manage to enforce some of these things digitally as well. And I think that is something that a lot of the regulators could take on to actually get stuff going and scale up. We, for example, coded a lot of the kind of enforcement for cookie banners. So we have a whole pipeline where we can actually find websites that violate stuff, find exactly the violations, put kind of the stuff together to make it a complaint, and then actually are able to fully enforce that as well, and also settle with the companies digitally. So we managed, for example, to get more than 40% of these violations just done by the computer and regulated with the companies without ever going to the actual authority. And that's quite interesting because there is a lot of these technical possibilities to actually enforce the GDPR or the law that we have in the digital space. And the regulators have no clue how to do that. So there's a lot of opportunity right now to actually move forward on that and enable some enforcement of these kind of mass violations that without technology you can't really do. Now, theoretically, you have these regulators. The reality is, I don't have it here in the slides, but on average, on one complaint or on complaints in Europe, you get 1.3% of the complaints that ever see a fine. So in reality, the regulators look the other way, don't do much, try to find a way not to enforce it. One option that you do have other than the regulators is that you go to the courts. So you theoretically are able to enforce your privacy rights. Most of the jurisdictions, that basically means you burn money. So to give you an idea, I had these data transfer cases that were at the Court of Justice where we won against Facebook. But the second case cost about 10 million euros in legal fees. And I was personally liable on that because the Irish regulator sued me and I was the defendant in this case. So you can imagine that having 10 million potential legal fees if you lose a case is not really overly appealing for people. In a similar situation, I also asked for damages and I got 400 euros in damages. So it's 25,000-fold the cost versus the benefit for litigation like that economically. And that basically means no one ever brings a privacy case in a normal court. What, however, does come up now, and that could be a game changer on a lot of that, is that Europe now allows kind of class sections. They now call it collective redress. And that could change a lot of the game, because suddenly you can group 1 million people together, and then the 10 million euro legal fees is just 10 euros per person, and then suddenly all of that makes much more sense. And that could actually change a lot of the legal dynamics around privacy and around how we do that in the European Union. What are the current cases that we're looking into? Right now, I think what comes up on our desk a lot is the question about global data transfers. This is a geography map, a democracy map of the whole world. And we now see more and more of these data transfers, for example, not just going to the US, but China, for example, where it's going to be really hard to make sure that any of your data is really protected from the government. That's a lot of the stuff we're looking into right now. There is more and more political targeting. A lot of the data that we want to protect for privacy reasons are later used, for example, to influence democratic processes and decision-making. Goes all the way down to the European Commission, even targeting some of its political messages towards political views of people, or even kind of the people that are meant to protect it use some of these tools. A big issue we see in Europe right now is this whole shift towards pay or okay. It also happens in the UK now, where instead of having this real option to say yes or no, you're now told to pay for not using your data. And that's quite interesting, because usually the profits that are made from advertisement is a couple of cents, but they charge you oftentimes a couple of €100 per year to actually keep your data, so it's massive overcharging. And it's kind of like, if you can't really afford it, you kind of lose your right to privacy. On this one, it's also quite interesting, because a lot of this decision-making is not evidence-based. We do have regulators that say if the consent is kind of freely given, which is the green on the left, then that's okay. If you use dark patterns, then that's not okay. That's kind of the orange in the middle, but you only get a consent rate about 50 or 70% with dark patterns, depending on what you do. Pay or okay, however, gets you 99%. So it's interesting that any regulator should usually say, okay, if this is the most extreme option, then that's obviously outlawed. However, the regulators are right now in the thing of, oh, it's journalism, so we have to protect that somehow, so we just look the other way if there is a violation like that. We usually call this last one like the North Korean consent rate, because we all know that basically 3% of people actually want it, 99% of people do it, but no one really does anything about it. There's more and more of these cases on, which is going to be really interesting on AI, obviously. There's a lot of the kind of basic privacy rights, like right to access and so on, that these companies are absolutely ignoring. Even if you just do a very simple request, basically that's ignored. And it's oftentimes argued that AI is not meant to work under the GDPR. So the GDPR is old and principles are coming from the 80s, and AI is also new. If you actually dig into it a bit more, it's interesting that when they drafted a lot of these GDPR principles, that were actually meant to cover the big algorithm that is going to come in the future that sucks up all the data, is going to make weird decisions, and we need some right to, for example, defend against that. Now where that actually became a reality, suddenly the argument is, now we need to change the law. So it's quite interesting that a lot of this law that we have there is actually preemptive and was foreseeing the future, and now where the future is coming closer, a lot of the narrative goes around to say now we have to get rid of the law. I sometimes joke about that, is like if we have a speeding limit while we still had horse-drawn carriages, and now where the Porsche comes around, everybody's like, let's get rid of the speeding limit. That's a bit what we're doing here in this discussion. But a lot of that has rather serious consequences. So we get more and more complaints where people are, for example, accused of sexual molesting kids with their real name and kind of identifiable to that person. It's obviously some hallucination of the system, but it can be repeated. It comes up as the first answer for people, and then the question is, can you delete it? Can you get rid of it? Can you get that rectified somehow? And right now, most of these companies just say, nah, we can't do anything about it. That's just how the system works. And that is obviously not really acceptable. Another one that was quite interesting is this whole Meta is just sucking up all the data out of social networks. That came up a year ago, and now basically everybody followed suit. Again, something where the regulator just looked the other way, and then everybody just followed and said, okay, then LinkedIn, we can take the data as well, and we can take it from Android phones and whatnot. So it's quite interesting how a lot of these barriers we used to have in the law are kind of falling bit by bit. Now, if that's a bit the situation we have right now, I would just talk about the future for 1 second at the end. what are we going to see probably the next couple of years, or at least the next couple of months even? Obviously, we now have this huge argument about kind of the economics of data and how much we have European tech startups or not, and how much we have to change because we do have regulation, and that may be the big reason why we don't have the Googles be in Europe. My personal view is that's not really because of regulation. I've hardly seen a specific product that didn't work with the GDPR, because actually the GDPR is quite permissive in a lot of normal data processing. There may be much more reasons about investment and financials and so on, and not having a big market. But what we see is that in politics, we now have kind of this hysteria of like, oh my God, we need to do something to allow more technology. And there would be two ways. One way would be to kind of go into more of an evidence-based approach and say, okay, what is really elements that we need to cut back, that we can simplify, and so on. Or the other way is just to take a lawnmower and just go over any law you find. And unfortunately, it looks like the European Commission is kind of going the second way. A big argument on all of that right now is usually the Draghi report. So a former Goldman Sachs banker and later central banker wrote a wonderful report where the GDPR is, for example, mentioned 2-3 times with 2-3 footnotes, not really what you would call evidence. But that is now used as an argument why we need to cut back on all of that. So it's a lot of these principles we used to have for the last 20 or 30 years are going to be pushed on hard the next couple of years. A lot of that is then used by the lobbyists to kind of really take these reports and say, oh, obviously we now have to move because Draghi said it. We'll see on Wednesday, so in 2 days, that the European Commission pushes out a new kind of amendment to the GDPR or changes to the GDPR. And the version that was leaked before shows kind of the thinking. And basically the thinking here is a bit like we want to have AI and we just cut through anything to get to AI, and basically what's cut through is, to a large extent, the GDPR. So we're basically gonna see a law potentially that just abolishes principles we had for 30 years to just say this may get us to the wonderful world of AI. Interestingly, it doesn't really manage that, so you can't even use AI with these new laws, but there are people in charge that oftentimes don't really know how the structure works and how these laws work, that just change a lot of these laws within really weeks, not even longer processes that we have. It's going to be interesting how the European Parliament is going to react to that, how the political landscape reacts, but we now see that a lot of these principles are massively under pressure. One of the reasons I'm still very much optimistic at the same time is what I mentioned before, is we do have these principles in the Charter in fundamental rights. So even if there is a political wind that goes into one direction, there's a certain barrier where politicians cannot go beyond, and that's going to be quite interesting. In the end, a lot of that is going to end up at the Court of Justice, which is going to make these decisions ultimately and say how far we can go in relaxing rules as well. And so far, usually the Court of Justice held up quite strongly. That can also change. That can change with the people that are there and the political wind. But so far, there is a system on the legal side that at least holds up rather strong so far. I hope that was all useful for you guys. If you're interested in more, you can find all of that obviously on our website. And I hope generally that was something that was giving you a bit of a broader view of this whole privacy debate from a legal side that may be a bit different than the rest here. Thanks a lot.